February 27, 1980. The 22nd Annual Grammy Awards. Michael Jackson walked into the Shrine Auditorium that night, expecting validation. He left with fury that would change music history forever. Off the Wall had sold 10 million copies. It had produced 4 top 10 singles on the Billboard Hot 100, something no solo artist had ever accomplished. Critics called it a masterpiece. Radio couldn't stop playing it. But when the Grammy nominations were announced, Michael Jackson received exactly 3, just 3. And when the actual awards were handed out, he won precisely one Grammy, for a record that had redefined what pop music could be. Let's talk about the night that broke Michael Jackson's heart and made him create the best-selling album of all time. To understand the snub, we have to go back to 1979 when Off the Wall dropped. Michael had been famous since childhood, obviously. The Jackson 5 had dominated the early 70s. But this was different. This was Michael stepping away from his brothers, from Motown, from everything familiar, and declaring himself a solo artist worthy of adult audiences. He'd partnered with Quincy Jones, a legendary producer who saw potential in the 20-year-old that nobody else quite grasped. They spent months in the studio crafting something that blended disco, funk, soul, and pop in ways that shouldn't have worked but absolutely did. Songs like Don't Stop Till You Get Enough showcased Michael's falsetto and energy. Rock With You was pure smoothness. Off the Wall, the title track, had an infectious joy. She's Out of My Life demonstrated emotional vulnerability that contradicted his youthful image. The album wasn't just successful commercially. Critics, notoriously difficult to impress when it came to former child stars trying to mature their sound, praised it universally. Rolling Stone, typically cynical about mainstream pop, called it brilliant. The album spent months on the charts, crossed racial boundaries on radio stations that typically segregated their playlists, and established Michael as more than just the cute kid from the Jackson 5. By every measurable standard, Off the Wall was a phenomenon. Michael had achieved what seemed impossible, transitioning from child star to legitimate adult artist without losing his audience or his credibility. The numbers supported this. 10 million copies sold in an era when that kind of sales figure put you in rarefied company. 4 top 10 singles from one album, breaking records that had stood for years. So when Grammy nomination morning arrived, Michael and his team expected recognition that matched the album's impact. They anticipated multiple nominations across major categories. Album of the Year seemed likely. Record of the Year for one of the singles felt guaranteed. Producer of the Year for Quincy Jones appeared inevitable. The actual nominations were insulting. Best R&B Vocal Performance, male for Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. Best R&B Vocal Performance, male again for the same song in a different category. Best Engineered Recording for Bruce Sweetian's work. That was it. 3 nominations total, all confined to R&B categories. The message was clear, even if nobody said it explicitly. Despite Off the Wall's pop success, despite it dominating mainstream radio, despite it selling to audiences of every demographic, the Recording Academy saw Michael Jackson as an R&B artist, not a pop artist, not an Album of the Year contender. Just another black musician making black music for black audiences. The categorization stung because it was exactly what Michael had been fighting against his entire career. He'd grown up watching black artists get pigeonholed, watching brilliant musicians confined to narrow categories while white artists doing similar work received broader recognition. Off the Wall had deliberately crossed those boundaries. The album succeeded with rock audiences, pop audiences, disco audiences, soul audiences. It was genuinely universal in its appeal, but the Grammy voters didn't see it that way, or chose not to. Grammy night itself was February 27, 1980, at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. Michael attended with his family, dressed impeccably as always, maintaining his public composure. Inside, according to people close to him, he was anxious. Even with limited nominations, winning in the categories where he'd been recognized would provide some validation. The ceremony proceeded through its various awards. When Best R&B Vocal Performance Male was announced, Michael won for Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. He went on stage, gave a brief gracious acceptance speech, thanked Quincy Jones and his family, The applause was warm. He returned to his seat holding a single Grammy. That was it, his only win of the evening. Off the Wall, one of the biggest albums of 1979, left the Grammys with one award. Album of the Year went to Billy Joel for 52nd Street. Record of the Year went to the Doobie Brothers for What a Fool Believes. Song of the Year went to the same Doobie Brothers track. All fine records, all deserving in their own right. But none had the cultural impact of Off the Wall. None had sold more. None had produced 4 top 10 singles. None had redefined an entire genre the way Michael's album had. Sitting in that auditorium, holding his single Grammy, watching other artists collect multiple awards, Michael made a decision. He later told Ebony magazine exactly what he thought that night and what he resolved to do about it. He decided he would make an album where every single song could be a hit single. An album so undeniably excellent, so commercially successful, so artistically accomplished, that the Recording Academy would have no choice but to recognize it. He was going to create an album with no B-sides. The ride home from the Grammys was quiet. Katherine Jackson later recalled her son seemed distant, processing something internally. When friends called to congratulate him on his win, Michael was polite but unenthusiastic. One Grammy for Off the Wall felt like an insult disguised as recognition. In the days and weeks following the ceremony, Michael's disappointment calcified into determination. He began having conversations with Quincy Jones about a follow-up album. These discussions had a different tone than the off-the-wall sessions. Michael wasn't just interested in making good music anymore. He wanted dominance. He wanted records that couldn't be ignored or categorized away or minimized. Quincy understood Michael's frustration. He'd experienced similar treatment throughout his career. Black musicians, no matter how successful, often found themselves confined to specific categories, their achievements measured against other black artists rather than against the entire industry. The Grammy snub had awakened something fierce in Michael, and Quincy recognized they could channel that anger into something productive. They agreed to collaborate again, but the parameters were different this time. Michael wanted co-producer credits on tracks where he felt his creative vision was driving the direction. He wanted more control over song selection. He wanted to push boundaries technically and artistically in ways that Off the Wall, as successful as it was, hadn't quite attempted. The album that would become Thriller began taking shape in Michael's mind throughout 1980 and into 1981. He wrote constantly, filling notebooks with lyrics and melody ideas. He thought about what had worked on Off the Wall and what could be elevated. The 4 top 10 singles proved his instinct for hit songs was strong, but he wanted more. He wanted every track to have that potential. Michael started writing songs that would eventually appear on Thriller. Wanna Be Startin' Somethin' came from his frustration with gossip and media intrusion. Billie Jean emerged from his experiences with obsessive fans and paternity accusations. Beat It was his attempt to create something that would force rock radio to play him. Each song had a strategic purpose beyond just being good music. He and Quincy started assembling a team. They brought back Bruce Swadian as recording engineer because his technical skill had been crucial to Off the Wall's sound. They began reaching out to session musicians and collaborators who could help realize the ambitious vision forming in Michael's head. Rod Temperton, who'd written Off the Wall and Rock With You, was recruited to contribute songs. Steve Porcaro from Toto got involved. James Ingram. The roster of contributors read like a who's who of elite musical talent. The recording sessions began in April 1982 at Westlake Recording Studios in Los Angeles. Michael approached these sessions with intensity that surprised even Quincy, who'd witnessed his perfectionism before. Michael insisted on dozens of takes for vocal tracks, searching for a delivery that matched the vision in his head. He'd record a line 50 times, listening critically to each take, rejecting 90% of them. The famous 4-minute bass intro on Billie Jean became a battleground. Quincy thought it killed the song's momentum. Michael insisted it was essential, that the build-up created tension that made the actual song hit harder. They argued about it multiple times. Eventually, they compromised on a shortened version that kept the essence of what Michael wanted, while addressing Quincy's concerns about radio play. Beat It represented Michael's most deliberate attempts to bridge racial divides in popular music. He'd written a rock song, something with genuine guitar-driven energy, specifically to force rock radio stations to play him. But he wanted authenticity, not just a pop star pretending to rock. That's when Quincy suggested Eddie Van Halen for the guitar solo. Getting Eddie involved was complicated. Van Halen was the biggest rock guitarist in the world at that moment. His band's album 1984 was dominating rock charts. Having him play on a Michael Jackson song seemed unlikely. But Quincy called, made the pitch, and Eddie agreed to do it for free. He showed up at the studio, rearranged parts of the track, and laid down that iconic solo in one take. The whole session took about 20 minutes. That solo changed everything for Beat It. It gave the song credibility with rock audiences who might have dismissed it as pop fluff. When the song eventually dropped, rock stations that had never played Michael Jackson suddenly had no excuse. The guitar work was undeniably rock. The song's energy matched anything in the genre. They had to play it. Michael's strategic thinking extended to every aspect of Thriller's creation. He understood that music videos were becoming increasingly important thanks to MTV's growing influence. He began conceptualizing videos that would be events in themselves, not just promotional tools. The Thriller video, which he started planning before the album even released, was envisioned as a short film with narrative structure, professional choreography, and production values that exceeded anything music videos had attempted. Throughout 1982, as the album came together, Michael's obsession with perfection intensified. He'd listen to rough mixes for hours, identifying tiny imperfections that nobody else heard. A backing vocal slightly off pitch, a drum hit that wasn't quite crisp enough, a transition between sections that could be smoother. He demanded fixes for all of it, sometimes to the frustration of the engineers and session musicians who thought the existing takes were already excellent. But Michael's ears were different. He heard music with a precision that bordered on superhuman. He could detect frequency issues that wouldn't register for most people. He understood instinctively how songs would translate on different sound systems, on radio, in clubs, in cars. That intuition guided his perfectionism. He wasn't being difficult for the sake of it. He genuinely heard things that needed correcting. The budget for Thriller ballooned beyond what Epic Records had anticipated. Recording costs approached $750,000, an enormous sum for an album at that time. The label got nervous. They'd expected Michael to deliver Off the Wall 2, a solid follow-up that would sell a few million copies and maintain his career momentum. What he was creating seemed riskier, more expensive, more ambitious than necessary. But Michael had leverage. Off the Wall's success meant Epic couldn't just shut down production. They had to trust that he and Quincy knew what they were doing. Even as costs climbed and the timeline stretched, Michael was betting his career on this album, vindicating his belief that the Grammy voters had been wrong, that Off the Wall deserved more recognition, that he deserved to be seen as more than just an R&B artist. The album was completed in November 1982 and released on November 30th. The title, Thriller, was Rod Temperton's contribution. He'd written the title track and suggested the album take the same name. Michael agreed, recognizing that the word had the right connotations. Thrilling, exciting, mysterious. It captured the album's energy. Initial reaction was positive but not overwhelming. Critics praised it as a worthy follow-up to Off the Wall. Sales started strong but not spectacularly. The first single, The Girl Is Mine, a duet with Paul McCartney, reached number 2 on the Hot 100. Good but not groundbreaking. There wasn't an immediate sense that Thriller was going to become what it ultimately became. Then Billie Jean dropped in January 1983. The song's combination of paranoid lyrics, that infectious bass line, and Michael's vocal performance connected with audiences in ways that transcended typical pop success. The song went to number 1 and stayed there for 7 weeks. More importantly, it broke through on rock radio, pop radio, R&B radio, dance radio. Every format played it constantly. The Billie Jean video compounded the song's success. MTV had launched in 1981 but famously refused to play black artists, claiming their format was rock-oriented. When Epic submitted Billie Jean, MTV initially rejected it for the same reason. Walter Yetnikoff, head of CBS Records, Epic's parent company, threatened to pull all CBS artists from the channel if they didn't add Michael Jackson to rotation. MTV capitulated. Billie Jean became the first video by a black artist to receive heavy rotation on the channel. The video itself, with Michael's performance on that light-up floor, became iconic. It demonstrated exactly what Michael had been trying to prove. His music transcended racial categories. Audiences of every demographic wanted to see it, wanted to hear it, wanted to buy it. Beat It followed in February and cemented what Billie Jean had started. The Eddie Van Halen guitar solo gave the song crossover appeal that made it undeniable. The video, featuring actual gang members from Los Angeles dancing alongside Michael in a choreographed sequence, was revolutionary. It received constant MTV airplay. The song hit #1 and stayed there for 3 weeks. By March 1983, Thriller had reached #1 on the Billboard 200. It would remain at the top for 37 non-consecutive weeks. The album was selling approximately 1 million copies per week at its peak. Every single released from it reached the top 10, 7 songs from one album in the top 10. Nobody had ever done that. Nobody has done it since. Michael's strategy of creating an album with no B-sides had worked beyond even his most optimistic projections. Wanna Be Startin' Something reached #5. Human Nature hit #7. PYT, Pretty Young Thing, made it to #10. Even album tracks that weren't released as singles became radio favorites. The entire album had become a cultural phenomenon. The Grammy nominations for the 1984 ceremony were announced in early January. Michael Jackson received 12 nominations, the most any artist had received in Grammy history to that point. The Recording Academy, which had given Off the Wall 3 nominations and 1 win, couldn't ignore Thriller's dominance. Album of the Year, Record of the Year for Beat It, Best Pop Vocal Performance, male for Thriller, Best R&B Vocal Performance, male for Billie Jean, Best R&B Song for Billie Jean, Best Rock Vocal Performance, male for Beat It, Producer of the Year for Quincy Jones. The nominations spanned every major category and multiple genres. Exactly what Michael had wanted. Exactly what Off the Wall had deserved, but didn't receive. February 28, 1984. The 26th Annual Grammy Awards, again at the Shrine Auditorium. Michael Jackson walked in wearing that iconic military-style jacket with medals and embellishments. He looked confident in ways he hadn't 4 years earlier. He knew what was coming. Everyone knew what was coming. The ceremony became, as the Washington Post described it, the Michael Jackson Show. He won Best R&B Vocal Performance, male for Billie Jean. Then Best Rock Vocal Performance, male for Beat It. Proving his music transcended genre boundaries. Best R&B Song for Billie Jean, Best New R&B Song for Billie Jean. He kept winning. Record of the Year for Beat It. Album of the Year for Thriller. When he accepted that final award, becoming the 3rd youngest recipient ever behind Barbra Streisand and Stevie Wonder, the vindication was complete. He'd done exactly what he'd promised himself. He'd created an album so excellent, so commercially successful, so culturally dominant, that the Recording Academy had no choice but to recognize it. Michael won 8 Grammys that night. 7 for Thriller and 1 for his narration on the E.T. Storybook album. The number 8 broke records that had stood for decades. It demonstrated that the young man who'd left the Grammys in 1980 with 1 award and a heart full of disappointment had returned in 1984 as the most dominant force in popular music. But here's what most people don't know about that triumph. After the ceremony, alone in his hotel room, surrounded by 8 Grammy Awards, Michael felt empty. He admitted this in interviews years later. The validation he'd sought so desperately didn't provide the satisfaction he'd expected. The external recognition couldn't fill the internal void. The Grammy snub of Off the Wall had motivated him to create Thriller. The Grammy sweep for Thriller proved he'd succeeded, but neither the rejection nor the acceptance changed how he felt about himself, about his appearance, about his childhood trauma, about his desperate need to be loved unconditionally by audiences worldwide. Thriller's success went beyond the Grammys, obviously. The album sold 70 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling album of all time. It spent 37 weeks at #1 on the Billboard 200. It produced 7 top 10 singles. It broke racial barriers on MTV and radio. It revolutionized music videos as an art form. It made Michael Jackson the biggest star on the planet. All of that traced directly back to February 27, 1980, when he left the Shrine Auditorium with 1 Grammy and made a promise to himself. He would create something undeniable. He would make music so good that categorization became impossible. He would force the industry to recognize him not as an R&B artist, or a pop artist, or a black artist, but simply as the best. The irony is that Off the Wall probably deserved Album of the Year in 1980. Its influence, its sales, its artistic achievement matched or exceeded most of the competition. But because it came from a young black artist, because it had disco influences at a moment when disco was dying, because the industry wasn't ready to recognize Michael Jackson as more than the kid from the Jackson 5, it got categorized away. That injustice created Thriller. Michael's anger and disappointment and determination to prove the doubters wrong generated the most successful album in recorded music history. Without the snub, Thriller might not exist, at least not in the form we know. Michael might have made another solid follow-up to Off the Wall without the driving need to create something revolutionary. The Grammy voters who overlooked Off the Wall inadvertently inspired the album that defined the 1980s and changed popular music forever. They gave Michael Jackson the motivation he needed to push beyond good into transcendent. They taught him that being excellent wasn't enough. He had to be undeniable. Thriller became undeniable. It sold more copies than any album before or since. It dominated every chart, every format, every medium. It made Michael Jackson synonymous with pop music itself. When people think of the 1980s, they think of Thriller. When they think of music videos as art, they think of the Thriller short film. When they think of albums that crossed every boundary, they think of those 9 songs that Michael and Quincy created in 1982, all because the Recording Academy gave Off the Wall 3 nominations and 1 win when it deserved so much more. All because Michael Jackson, 21 years old and devastated, decided he would never give them the option to overlook him again. All because rejection handled correctly can become rocket fuel. The lesson extends beyond Michael Jackson and beyond music. Sometimes the most important moments in any creative career are the rejections. The times when your work gets overlooked despite its merit. The moments when people who should know better fail to recognize what you've created. Those moments can destroy you, or they can motivate you to create something so excellent that overlooking it becomes impossible. Michael chose the second path. The Grammy snub broke his heart. Thriller was his response. He took the pain of that rejection and transformed it into the best-selling album of all time, into 8 Grammy Awards, into a legacy that 40 years later remains untouchable. February 27, 1980 was the worst night of Michael Jackson's professional life at that point. It led directly to the creation of the greatest night of his career, February 28, 1984, and everything that came with it. The snub wasn't fair, but the art it inspired was worth more than fairness.